Shabbat Shalom, everyone. It's wonderful to be back in the sanctuary. We all had a nice rest and ready to join with me. I'm just going to turn off this here. Okay, why don't we warm up a little bit by just singing. Yalalai, lai, lai, la, lai. Yalalai, lai, lai, la, lai. Yalalai, lai, lai, la, lai. Yalalai, lai, lai. Yalalai, lai, lai, la, lai. Yalalai, lai, lai, la, lai. Yalalai, lai, lai, la, lai. Yalalai, lai, lai. Yalalai, la, la, lai, la, lai, la, la, lai. Yalalai. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Just let's take a moment for ourselves, close our eyes, and reflect before we begin our service this morning. We open our eyes, let's take a deep breath in, and a deep breath out, and we'll open our prayer books, our Sidurim, to page 186 to begin our service with thanks and gratitude. Modeh ani lefanecha melech chai v'kayam. Modeh ani lefanecha melech chai v'kayam. Modeh ani lefanecha. Thanks to you, Adonai, ever-living sovereign, that you have restored my soul to me in mercy. How great is your trust. Turn now to page 192. Ma tohu ohalecha Yaakov mishkenotecha Yisrael. Turn now together to page 194. We'll read the blessing for our bodies in Hebrew at the top of the page. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher yatzar et ha'adam b'chokhmah, uvaravo nekavim nekavim, chalulim chalulim, galui v'yadua lifnei chisei chavodecha, she'im yipatech echad mehem, o yisatem echad mehem, I efshar lehitkayem v'la'amod lefanecha. Baruch atah Adonai, rofeh chol basar, umafli la'asot. We turn now to page 196, a prayer for our souls. Elohai neshama shenatata b'tehor ahi. Elohai neshama shenatata b'tehor ahi. Elohai Adonai neshama shenatata mi tehorahi. Join with me in English on the bottom, page 196. My God, the soul you have given me is pure. You created it, you shaped it, you breathed it into me, and you protect it within me. For as long as my soul is within me, I offer thanks to you, Adonai, my God and God of my ancestors, source of all creation, sovereign of all souls. Praised are you, Adonai, in whose hand is every living soul and the breath of humankind. Baruch atah Adonai, asher biado nefesh kol chai, beruach kol b'sar ish. We turn now to page 198, if you would please rise. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher natan lasach bivina, le'avchin ben yom u'ben layla. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, bokeach ivrim. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, matir asurim. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, zokef kefufim. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, rokah haaretz al hamayim. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, hamechin mitzadei gaver. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, malbish arumim. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, hanoten le'aev koach. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, Hamavir shena meinai utenuma me'af apai. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, she'asani b'tzelem Elohim. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, she'asani ben chorin. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, she'asani Yisrael. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, ozer Yisrael b'gvura. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, oter Yisrael b'tifarah. Please be seated. If you are standing, we're now on page 204. We'll read the blessing at the top of the page in Hebrew and the English towards the bottom of the page. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. O Adonai our God, let the words of Torah be sweet in our mouths and the mouths of your people Israel, so that we, our descendants and the descendants of all your people Israel, may know you by studying your Torah for its own sake. Blessed are you, Adonai, who teaches Torah to your people Israel. Baruch atah Adonai, hamelamed Torah le'amo Yisrael. We're now on page 206. Elu devarim shehin lahem shiur, she'adam ochel pirotehem ba'olam hazeh, והקרן קיימת לו לעולם הבא, ואלו הן כיבוד אב ואם וגמילות חסדים, והשכמת בית המדרש שחרית וערבית, והכנסת אורחים וביקור חולים, והכנסת כלה לוויית המת ועיון תפילה, והבאת שלום בין אדם לחברו, ותלמוד תורה כנגד כולם. Now I ask those at home who are able to please rise as we turn to page 212 for the opening blessing of Pezukei V'Zimra. Baruch she'amar v'haya ha'olam baruch hu, Baruch Oseh Bereshit, Baruch Omer Ve'Yosef, Baruch Gozer Umekayem, Baruch Merachem al haaretz, Baruch Merachem al habriot, Baruch Meshalem Sachar Tov Livreyav, Baruch Chalad V'Kayam Lanetzach, Baruch Bodeh Umatzil, Baruch Shemo, Bishmachot Uvizmirot Negadelcha, Unshamecha Nefecha V'Nazkir Shimcha V'Namlichecha, Malkeinu Eloheinu, יחיד חיי העולמים, מלך משובח ומפואר עד שמו הגדול, ברוך אתה אדוני, מלך מהולל בתשבחות. We turn now to page 214. We are seated at home, we're still standing, and we're now in the second line down from the top of the page. Tov lehodol Adonai, Tov lehodol Adonai, ulezamer leshimcha elyon, Tov lehodol Adonai, lehagid baboker chasdecha, lehagid baboker chasdecha, ve'emunatcha ba'leilot, ve'emunatcha ba'leilot, tov lehodot l'Adonai, alei asur v'alei navel, alei gayon bechinur, כי שימחתני אדוני בפועלך, במעשה ידיך רנן. מגנו מעשיך ים, מאוד עמקו מחשבותיך. מגנו מעשיך ים, מאוד עמקו מחשבותיך. מגנו מעשיך ים, מאוד עמקו מחשבותיך. אשרי יושבי ביתך, עוד יהללוך, עוד יהללוך. אשרי יושבי ביתך, עוד יהללוך, עוד יהללוך. סלע אשרי העם שלו. אנחנו נברך ים, מעתה ביד עולם, מעתה ביד עולם, מעתה ביד עולם, הללויה, הללויה, hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. We're now on page 218. Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. Hallelujah, el bekocho. Hallelujah, birkiauzo. Hallelujah, bigurotav. Hallelujah, kerokulo. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. Hallelu, hallelu, hallelu. Hallelu, hallelu, hallelu. Hallelu, hallelu, hallelu. Hallelu, beteka shofar. Hallelu, benebel bechinor. Hallelu, betofu machol. Hallelu, bemim ve'ugav. Hallelu, hallelu, hallelu. Hallelu, hallelu, hallelu. Hallelu, hallelu, hallelu. Hallelu, hallelu, hallelu. Hallelu, betziltzalei shamam. Hallelu, betziltzalei truam. Kol hanshama tehallelia. Hallelu, hallelujah. Hallelu, hallelu, hallelu. Hallelu, hallelu, hallelu. Hallelu, hallelu, hallelu. Hallelu, hallelu, hallelujah. Nishmat kol chai tevarech et shimcha Adonai Eloheinu v'ruch masot. Now on page 220. Ilu finu alei shira kayam ulshonehinu rina kamon galav vesiftotenu shevach kemachevei rakia veinenu meirot kashemesh vechayareach Ve'yadinu frusot kenishrei shamayim Ve'raglinu kalot kayalot Ein anachnu maspikim lehodot lecha Adonai Eloheinu ve'Elohei avotenu ve'imotenu levarech And on page 222, second paragraph down for the very top of the page. Shochen ad marom v'kadosh shemo v'chatuv ranenu tzadikim b'Adonai la yesharim na'ava tehillah Befi yesharim titalalu divrei tzadikim titbarachu b'lshon chasidim titromamu b'kerev kedoshim titkadashu ma'kehalot ribevot amcha Yisrael berina yitpa'ar shimcha makeinu bechol dor v'ador yababai yababai bye 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 yababai yababai bye bye yai bye bye yai bye bye yababai bye bye Ay babai, babai, ay bye bye. Ishtabach shimcha alad malkeinu. If you can at home, please rise as we're on page 223 האל המלך הגדול והקדוש בשמיים ובארץ, כי לך נאה אדוני אלוהינו ואלוהי אבותינו ואמותינו, שהוא שפחה לה וזמרה עוז וממשלה נצח, גדולה וגבורה תהילה ותפארת קדושה ומלכות, ברכות והודאות מעתה ועד עולם. ברוך אתה אדוני אל מלך גדול בתשבחות, אל ההודאות אדוני נפלאות, הבוחר בשירי זמרה, מלך אל חיי העולמים. We're on page 224. יתקדש ויתקדש שמי רבה, בעלמא דברה חירותי וימליך מלכותי, וחייכון וימכון וחיי לכל בית ישראל, בגלה ובזמן קריב במהרו אמן. ישמי רבה מבורך לעולם לימי עלמיה, יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא, ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי דקודשא בריחו, לעילם עם כל ברכתה ושירתה, תושבחתה ונחמתה דמרת בעלמא במהרו אמן. ברכו את אדוני המבורך. ברוך אדוני המבורך לעולם ועד. Please be seated at home. We're now on page 228. We'll begin by reading together in English at the bottom of the page, and then the 3 lines of Hebrew just above it, beginning with the words Or Chadash. Praised are you, Adonai, our God, sovereign of the universe, creator of light and darkness, who makes peace and fashions all things. In mercy you illumine the world and those who live upon it. In your goodness you daily renew creation. How numerous are your works, Adonai, in wisdom you formed them all, filling the earth with your creatures. Be praised, Adonai, our God, for the excellent work of your hands, and for the lights you created, may they glorify you. Shine a new light upon Zion, that we all may swiftly merit its radiance. Praised are you, Adonai, creator of all heavenly lights. Or Chadash, Al Tzion Ta'ir. Or Chadash, Al Tzion Ta'ir. V'nizkechu lanu, v'nizkechu lanu, mehera leorom. V'nizkechu lanu, mehera leorom. Yadadai da bim bim bam, yadadai da bim bam, yadadai da bim bim bam, yadadai da da. Yadadai da bim bim bam, yadadai da bim bam, yadadai da bim bim bam, yadadai da da. Baruch atah Adonai yotzer hameorot. Turn now to page 230. We'll begin by reading the English together at the top of the page and then the Hebrew at the bottom. How deeply you have loved us, Adonai our God, gracing us with surpassing compassion. On account of our forebears whose trust led you to teach them the laws of life, be gracious to us, teaching us as well. O merciful one, have mercy on us by making us able to understand and discern, to heed, learn, and teach, and lovingly to observe, perform, and fulfill all that is in your Torah. V'ha'er eineinu b'toratecha v'dabek libeinu b'mitzvotecha v'yachel levaveinu le'ahava u'yira et shemecha ve'lo nevosh ve'lo nikalem ve'lo nikashel le'olam va'ed ki v'shem kodshecha Agadol ve'anora batachnu, nagila ve'nismecha, Nagila v'nismecha v'yeshuatecha ve'avienu leshalom me'arba kanfot haaretz ve'tolichenu komemiut le'artzeinu Kiel poel Yeshuot ata U'anu b'charta Ve'kirahavtanu le'shimcha Hagadol sela b'emet Leodot lecha lechetcha b'ahava Baruch ata Adonai Habocher b'amo Yisrael B'ahava Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. We're now on page 234. Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha b'chol levavcha v'chol nafshecha v'chol me'odecha ve'hayu advarim ha'ele Asher Anochi mitzavcha hayom al levavecha v'shinatam levanecha v'dibarta bam v'shivtecha b'veitecha u'v'lechtecha v'derech u'shofbecha u'vkumecha u'kshartam leot ayadecha v'hayu letotafot bein inecha u'chtavtam al mezuzot beitecha Ubi She'arecha, page 236. Vayomer Adonai el Moshe lemor daber el bnei Yisrael v'amarta alehem v'asu lahem tzitzit al kanfei bigdehem ledorotam v'natnu al tzitzit hakanaf betil techelet v'haya lachem letzitzit uritem noto Uschartem et kol mitzvot Adonai v'asitem otam ve'lo taturu acharei levavchem v'acharei einechem asher atem zonim achareihem leman tizkeru v'asitem et kol mitzvotai v'item kedoshim leloechem ani Adonai Eloechem asher hotzeiti etchem me'eretz Mitzrayim liot lachem Elohim Ani Adonai Elohechem, Adonai Elohechem, Emet. We turn now to the top of page 239. Emet, there is no place where you are not. Even in the wilderness, there is your word. Emet, that pen strokes of lightning, white fire, black flame, stir the soul's passion, guide our sacred way. True and enduring is Torah. Your truth for us is certain and established, now and forevermore. Like Moses, Miriam, and all Israel, we sing out and rejoice. Bye 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 bye. Bye 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 bye. Yay bye 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 bye. Tehilot le'elyon baruch hu mevorach Moshe u'Miriam u'bnei Yisrael lechanu shira besimcha rabba ve'amru chulam mi chamocha ma'elim Adonai mi kamocha nedar b'kodesh norat teilot osef elei bye 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 shira chadasha shibchu geulim leshimcha al sfat hayam yachad kulam hodu והמליכו והאמרו אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד Israel, ufidechenu mecha Yehuda ve'Yisrael. Go aleinu Adonai tzavahot shemo, Kedosh Yisrael, Baruch atah Adonai, Gal Yisrael. For those who are standing, we remain standing on page 242. We'll begin together the Amidah and then continue silently. As always, please go at your own pace, and when you're finished, if you are standing, you may be seated, otherwise to remain seated. Adonai sefatai tiftach ufi agi tehilatecha. Adonai, open up my lips that my mouth may declare your praise. Turn now to page 324 for the repetition of the Amidah. If you're continuing your silence, please continue at your own pace and join us when you can. If you choose to rise, please do so. Again, page 324. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu, Elohei Avotenu Imotenu, Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov, Elohei Sarah, Elohei Rivka, Elohei Rachel, Elohei Leah, Ha'el HaGadol, HaGibor VeHaNorah, El Elyon, Gomel Chasadim Tovim, Vekoneh HaKol, Vezocher Chasdei Avot Ve'imahot, Umevi Gula Livnei V'neihem Leman Shemo B'Yahava, Melech Ozer U'Moshia U'Magen, Baruch atah Adonai, Magen Abraham Ve'Zrat Sarah, Atah Gibor Le'olam Adonai, Mechayim Meitim Atah Rav Le'Hoshia, Morid Hatal, Mechalkel Chaim Bechesed, Mechayim Meitim Berachamim Rabim, Sohamech Noflim Ve'Rofech Cholim, Umatir Asurim, Umekayem Emunato, Lishenei Afar, Micha Mocha Bal Gevurot, Umido Melach, Melech Menit, Umechayem, Umatzmiach Yeshua, V'nemanat al Achayot Metim, Baruch atah Adonai, Mechayei HaMeitim. We're now on page 326. Nekadesh et Shimcha Ba'olam, Keshem Shemapi Shimoto Bishmei Marom, Kakatuv al Yad Neviecha, Vekazel Ze Ve'amar, Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzevaot, Meloch Kol Haaretz, Kevodo, Adir, Adirenu Adonai, Adonenu Madir Shimcha Bechol Haaretz, Baruch Kevod Adonai Mimkomo, Echadu Eloheinu, Uavinu Malkeinu, Umoshienu Ve'u Yashmienu, Berachamav Le'nei Kol Chai, on page 328. Ledor vador, ledor vador, ledor vador nagid kol lecha, ledor vador, ledor vador, ledor vador nagid kol lecha, ulenetzach netzachim kedushatcha nakdish, kedushatcha nakdish, לשבחך אלוהינו מפינו לא ימוש, לעולם לעולם ועד. ברוך אתה אדוני האל הקדוש. Please be seated at home. We're on page 329, the very top of the page. Ismechu v'malechutecha shomrei 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 Shabbat v'korei oneg Shabbat. Ismechu v'malechutecha shomrei 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 Shabbat v'korei oneg Shabbat. Mekadshei mekadshei shiri Shabbat, kulam yisbehu v'yitangu mituvecha Shabbat. Ismechu v'malechutecha shomrei 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 Shabbat v'korei oneg Shabbat. Ismechu v'malechutecha shomrei 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 Shabbat v'korei oneg Shabbat. Ve'hashvi'i ratzita bo v'kidashto Shabbat, chemdat yamim oto kerata Shabbat. Yismechu v'malechutecha shomrei 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 Shabbat v'korei oneg Shabbat. Zecher lemasei lemasei bereishit Shabbat, zecher lemasei lemasei bereishit Shabbat. Ismechu v'malechutecha shomrei 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 Shabbat v'korei oneg Shabbat. Eloheinu v'Eloi avotenu v'imotenu, ritzei ritzei v'imnuchateinu, kadeshenu b'mitzvotecha v'ten chelkenu b'toratecha, sahabeinu mituvecha v'samechenu yeshuatecha, v'taer libeinu le'ovtecha be'emet ve'anchileinu Adonai Eloheinu ayin 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 la 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 Ratzon Shabbat Kodshecha, Vaynuchu Yisrael Mekadshei Shemecha, Baruch Ata Adonai Mekadesh HaShabbat. Now on page 330, we'll read together in English in the middle of the page. On this Shabbat day, as you graciously receive our prayers, help us to hear your call. Grant us enough health to fulfill our duties and the compassion we need to attend to others. Teach us humility that we may perceive our own faults, and grant us the wisdom to be forgiving of others. Give us the courage to be true to our highest selves and the charity to see the best in those around us. Give us patience enough not to become discouraged, hope enough to overcome all fears for the future, and faith enough to know your presence. O source of blessing, look with favor upon us. May our offerings be acceptable to you. Baruch Ata Adonai, she'otcha levadcha bira navod. Turn now to page 332. And we'll begin reading in the English at the bottom of the page. And after each paragraph, we say the words in Hebrew, Modim Anachnu Lach, offering our gratitude and thanks to God for all of these gifts. For the expanding grandeur of creation, worlds known and unknown, galaxies beyond galaxies filling us with awe and challenging our imaginations, Modim Anachnu Lach. For this fragile planet Earth, its times and tides, its sunsets and seasons, Modim Anachnu Lach. For the joy of human life, its wonders and surprises, its hopes and achievements, Modim Anachnu Lach. For human community, our common past and future hope, our oneness transcending all separation, our capacity to work for peace and justice in the midst of hostility and oppression, Modim Anachnu Lach. For high hopes and noble causes, for faith without fanaticism, for understanding of views not shared, Modim Anachnu Lach. For all who have labored and suffered for a fairer world, who have lived so that others might live in dignity and freedom, Modim Anachnu Lach. For human liberties and sacred rights, for opportunities to change and grow, to affirm and choose, Modim Anachnu Lach. We pray that we may live not by our fears, but by our hopes, not by our words, but by our deeds. Baruch atah Adonai, hatov shimcha, ulechanae lehodot. We're now on page 334, Sim Shalom. Sim Shalom, Tova uvracha, chen v'chesed merachamim aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael ha'amecha, varcheinu yotzreinu kulanu kechad, ve'or panecha, ki ve'or panecha natata lanu, Adonai Eloheinu. Sim Shalom, Tova uvracha, chen v'chesed merachamim aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael ha'amecha, Torat chaim ve'ahavat chesed, utzedaka uveracha berachamim v'chaim v'shalom. Sim Shalom, Tova uvracha, chen v'chesed merachamim aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael ha'amecha, v'tov einecha levarech et amcha Yisrael bechol eit ubechol sham b'shlomecha. Sim Shalom, Tova uvracha, chen v'chesed merachamim aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael amecha. Baruch atah Adonai ha'mevarech et amo Yisrael b'shalom. Let's turn now to page 337. We'll read together in English at the top of the page. Prayer is not purely an act. All things pray and all things pour forth their souls. The heavens pray, the earth prays, every creature and every living thing. In all life there is longing. Creation is itself but a longing, a kind of prayer to the Almighty. What are the clouds, the rising and the setting of the sun, the soft radiance of the moon and the gentleness of the night? What are the flashes of the human mind and the storms of the human heart? They are all prayers, the wordless outpouring, a boundless longing for God. Hoseh shalom bimromav, uyaseh shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael, ve'al kol yoshvei tefel, yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael, yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael. Seder Kriyat Torah, the Torah service begins on page 362. If you are able at home, please rise. Again, page 362. Ein kamocha b'Elohim Adonai v'ein kema'asecha malchutcha malchut kol olamim u'memshaltecha b'chol dor v'ador Adonai melech Adonai malach Adonai imloch le'olam va'ed Adonai oz le'mo yitein Adonai yivarech et amo v'shalom Ava rachamim eitiva v'rtzoncha et Zion Tivnei chomot Yerushalayim Ki mecha levad batachnu Melech el Ram benisa Adon olamim Ki mitzion tetzei Torah Ki mitzion tetzei Torah Udevar Adonai mi Yerushalayim Baruch Shenatan Torah Torah Baruch Shenatan Torah Torah Le'amo Yisrael B'Kdushato Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad Echad Eloheinu Gadol Adonenu Kadosh Shemo Gadol Adonai Iti Une'omema Shemo Yachtav Lecha Adonai Hagedula Ve'hagevura Ve'atiferet Ve'anetzach Ve'ahod Ki chol b'shamayim u'ba'aretz Ki chol b'shamayim u'ba'aretz Lecha Adonai hamamacha ve'amitnaseh lechol erosh Romemu Adonai Eloheinu ve'ishtachavu le'akodsho Romemu Adonai Eloheinu ve'ishtachavu le'akodsho Ki kadosh Adonai Eloheinu romemu Ki kadosh Adonai Eloheinu romemu Adonai Eloheinu ve'ishtachavu le'akodsho Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Boker Tov. This morning we are reading from Parshat Re'eh, as we are moving our way through the last book of the Torah, through the book of Deuteronomy, through Moses' last teachings to the children of Israel before his death and before they entered the land of Israel. This morning we're going to focus towards the actually very, very beginning of chapter 13 of the book of Deuteronomy. The first verse, as a matter of fact, is going to be the main focus of my teaching this morning. If you're following at home in the Plowed Chumash, it's on page 1263, page 1263. If you're following in the women's commentary, you are looking for page 1123. Page 1123 in the women's, 1263 in the Plowed. And again, if you're looking online, you're looking for chapter 13, verse 1 in the book of Deuteronomy. In this case, this is one of the more interesting and truly more impactful psukim in the Torah in terms of its long-term effect on the eventual creation of Rabbinic Judaism, the concept of Rabbinic Halacha in terms of observance, and in terms of the very nature of the relationship between us and the interpretation of and the application of, I should say probably more accurately, of the Torah itself. And interestingly enough, this is also one of these verses that just from a organizational standpoint begins in English the 13th chapter of the book of Deuteronomy. But if you look very carefully at the way that it's laid out in both the Plowed and the Women's Chumash, and even probably online to some degree, is that it really actually feels like it's attached to the previous chapter. Right? You'll see verse 31, and then immediately chapter 13, verse 1, and then there will be a gap between the second verse. And that is because in the Torah itself, in the Torah writing in the scroll, in fact, there is a break there. Right? A new paragraph begins with the second verse, not the first. And there's lots of reasons why this happens in the Torah, but in this case, this verse is being applied both backwards, retrojective to what comes before it, and actually forwards as well, depending on which commentator is talking about it. So either it is in reference to or in connection to the previous description, which is about being particularly cautious around the religions and the practices and the cultures of the land of Israel's inhabitants before the children of Israel go through and conquer the land. And the second part is a prohibition of watching out for false prophets. So this verse has a sort of interesting fulcrum experience in which it's kind of related to both, and yet at the same time what I'll talk about today is actually sort of disconnected from both of those and is as more of a general principle in Judaism and its challenges and its application. So enough preamble, let's get to the text itself. So what does it say in Hebrew? Et kol hadavar asher anochi metzaveh etchem oto tishmeru la'asot lo tosef alav velo tigra mimenu. Okay, so et kol hadavar asher anochi metzaveh etchem. Okay, all of these things that God, and through Moshe, am tishmeru la'asot. Usually it says here to enjoin upon you. Shomer, tishmeru, hishamer is to cause something to be guarded. Like a shomer is a guard of some sort or another. So shomer Shabbat, for example, is a protector of or a guard of Shabbat. And this will become an important phrase. And la'asot is things that we do, right? So to basically be guarding of and careful of the observances, the mitzvot, that we are being told we are meant to do. And here is the main issue. Lo tosef alav, don't add to them, but lo tigra mimenu, and do not take away from them either. Okay, and so you can imagine this is a big statement. Okay, so what is the it, first of all, that we are referring to? Right? There is this wonderful thing in Hebrew in which the object is not always explicitly mentioned in the grammar, but is implicitly mentioned. So the question, of course, that we already ask is this related to the specific issues previously discussed about being cautious around the commandments relating to how we're supposed to relate to the cultures and religions of the land of Israel after it is conquered? Are we supposed to relate it to the issues about being cautious around false prophets? Or are we potentially supposed to see this as a larger concept, right? A blanket statement that says all of these mitzvot, everything that we have been told in the Torah and Deuteronomy, everything that's been expressed by God as obligations of mitzvot, that we should neither add to them nor take away from them. In other words, that they are what they are, the Torah is what it is, we are instructed accordingly, and therefore we are meant to do, at least if we read this verse in a vacuum, to do exactly what it says, neither adding nor taking away. So, of course, this is a very big statement, and one that is immediately problematic when it comes to, for example, Rabbinic Judaism. Because principally, if one reads the Talmud extensively and eventually its codes all the way to the Shulchan Aruch and the things that followed it, it's very clear that there are many things that we do that are considered mitzvot and practices that, albeit derived, at least according to the rabbis, from verses of Torah, are not necessarily explicitly written in the Torah. That many of the things that we consider to be normative Judaism are not things that are explicitly mentioned in detail in the Torah, but are in fact interpretations of one form or the other by the rabbis that ultimately become ritual practices, observances, halakha, etc. So the question, of course, is if the Torah is telling us not to add or to take away, how does that then jive with all of these things that are seemingly some form of addition in the form of change or the form of adaptation. So the rabbis offer lots of different, potentially plausible explanations, that in fact what they're saying actually here is not really meant to be a general principle necessarily, but it's actually talking very specifically. And in the case of, for example, the classic commentator Chizkuni says that when it says don't add to things, it's actually referring to specifically the offering up of sheep, goats, bulls, etc. That when the Torah tells us that we're meant to offer a particular amount of something, we only do the amount that is described. We don't do less than it, and we don't do more than it. Okay, so it's a fairly simple and straightforward answer, which makes a certain amount of sense, right? In this particular case, it's a fairly narrow scope. The mitzvahs according to offerings, the commandments according to offerings, should be followed as they are. I would draw this as sort of saying that, for example, if there is a classic food recipe, right, that you don't deviate from the recipe, you follow it to the letter. This is less of a concern probably with cooking and more with baking. If you're even a quarter of a teaspoon off, depending on the ingredient, you can throw the entire thing off. Okay, so Chizkuni is basically saying along those lines, don't mess with it. It's a great recipe, don't mess with it, leave it as it is. Okay? And neither are you basically supposed to take away from it either, he says. So Rashi has a similar kind of idea, but he relates it to something else. He does say that it is a more general principle, but it's not in relationship to what Chizkuni is talking about only, right? It's not just about the offerings, but he says that here are some examples of what we're talking about. Okay, so he says, for instance, don't place 5 chapters in the tefillin, right? Because that's beyond what it says to say. Don't put 5 species of fruit and plants in the fulfillment of the command of the lulav, right? In terms of the taking of the arba'a minim, right? The 4 species. Don't add a 5th. And don't recite 4 instead of 3 blessings in the benediction of the priest. In other words, for the priestly blessing, which is the threefold blessing, 3 psukim in a row, don't add a 4th. Okay, just don't do it. So again, Rashi is not necessarily changing things, and he's drawing, by the way, from the Midrash from Sifrei on this reading. He's just basically saying that what Chizkuni says is true, but it's not just about the question of the sacrifices. It's really about any place in terms of mitzvot in the Torah in which we're giving a finite amount of something or number of something or number of times or date, whatever it is, that there is precision involved, that we're not meant to mess with that precision. Even if it may seem more rational or logical or easier or whatever it is, if the Torah says, put X number of things, follow that recipe to a T. So I've sort of been wrapping my head around this a little bit, and it's part of a larger issue that I've always sort of had with Rabbinic Judaism, which is where do we draw the line between what is acceptable to evolve or adapt or to change, and where do we say that actually, no, it must be fixed, it cannot be changed, we don't add to it or subtract from it. Because I think Judaism has proven time and time again that we are neither one extreme or the other. That we try very hard to continue traditions generation to generation, that we continue mitzvot and obligations generation to generation. But obviously, especially in these days, we see there are lots of variations of Jewish practice and theology and philosophy. So how do we reconcile these kind of 2 pieces here? So Nachmanides has a sort of interesting view on this as well. Nachmanides is something of a contemporary of Rashi's 12th century, 13th, 12th century, late 1200s, early 1300s. For example, right, if this is a situation as such, if we agree with the idea that we are not meant to either add or subtract, how is it, Nachmanides asks, that we actually have made, the rabbis in particular, have made so many of what are called the siyag leTorah, fences around the Torah. In other words, prohibitions that go beyond what the Torah says to us is a prohibition. And he gives a few examples, right? He says, for example, on Shabbat, and in terms of working that's prohibited on Shabbat, the Torah doesn't really say explicitly what to do. The rabbis ultimately determine from a complicated series of rhetorical decisions what is prohibited on Shabbat and what is allowed based upon what was involved in the construction of the Mishkan and eventually of the temple. But it says basically that there are all these other things that even if that's not on the prohibited list, the rabbis say that we should avoid as much as possible on Shabbat, even if it's not the one that's actually listed as a prohibition. And he says, if something has no use on Shabbat, we say don't even handle it at all. It's what's called muktzah. Okay? The idea is that even though it's really not on the list, just the thought of touching something that potentially has no use whatsoever on Shabbat, it's unnecessary, we just simply leave it alone. That is a siyag l'Torah. It is an added layer of protection around the Torah. And the same is true of many of the laws of kashrut. I've mentioned this many times about, for example, what happens when we have the verse that says, don't boil a kid in its mother's milk, and how that eventually became this complicated series of separation of milk and meat in a kosher home and a kosher observance. And how we got from a fairly specific verse in the Torah to something that is much more broad and encompassing. And Nachmanides explains that this is largely based around this idea of building a siyag l'Torah, building a guard around the Torah. So I've always found these fences to be somewhat problematic because in my mind some of the fences are, quite frankly, too tall. That if they were meant simply to cause, right, for example, all right, here's an analogy. If you go to the Grand Canyon and you're on the precipice of the Grand Canyon, you want to be able to see out everything in front of you. But at the same time, you also don't want to accidentally fall into the Grand Canyon. So often, you will see in situations like this a barrier that is put up to prevent the body from falling in, right? It is just high enough to prevent the accident from taking place, but not so tall as to not be able to see over it and to see what it is that you want. So that I've found over my life, this is just me speaking, that some of the siyag l'Torah that's been created by the rabbis are appropriate in terms of their height. They're appropriate to keeping me from falling into doing things that I otherwise should not do. But many of the other ones, especially as it relates to laws of daily halacha, of Shabbat observance, of kashrut observance, that these are fences that, in my estimation, have been built too high, that they obscure what actually was an intention of the Torah itself, even with the best of intention to protect us from accidentally violating something, that I think that they have gone a step too far. And Nachmanides says that actually this is an important concept himself. What he says is that it's not a problem that we put these siyag l'Torah. And in fact, actually, it's an important thing for us to do that. He says it's actually good and it's even necessary. But here's the distinction. He says, as long as we all know that this is a fence and not directly from God in God's Torah. In other words, we have to be aware of who put the fence up in the first place, who put up the siyag l'Torah, and what was their rationale and their reasoning. And what he's trying to say basically is that for the most part, he believes that these siyag l'Torah that were constructed by the original rabbis and by successive generations are appropriate and they are necessary. But for those of us who find challenge with some of them, I think his main piece here is to understand that what we're dealing with, where we're struggling, is not necessarily what the Torah says, but what the rabbis have designed around it. And while the rabbis of old and the sort of classic halachic view will always say that the Torah Shebaal Peh, the oral tradition, is as important, or at least in a similar importance to the Torah itself, there's always a rabbinic understanding that the Torah is at the apex, right? That we are trying our best to understand and to connect to this first, and everything deriving from there. And just as any element of human interaction in religion, there is always the chance of going a step too far, right? Or building a fence that may have been appropriate for the communities of 1,000 years ago, but perhaps is not quite as necessary today. Right? In the same way that we have protections that are in place for growing children, and as they grow, we take those protections away. Right? When Eva was a child, we had to put manners of locks on every conceivable door and opening in our house. And as a 4.5-year-old, we trust her more and more to trust her own instincts. So this is the balancing act. Okay? And the key piece here, I think the takeaway for me, is that it's not a question of us not having the agency to be able to add and subtract, so to speak, from the experiences described in the Torah. We do it all the time, right? Many, many things like, for example, all of the matters of corporal punishment, right? We have essentially, for all intents and purposes, taken that away. But the key piece is that we didn't erase the words from the Torah. We didn't take them out when they were uncomfortable. We left them in, but we also understood that at a certain point that we have not only an acceptable role, but one that probably is necessary in order to not add or subtract to the actual letters, but to add to the places in which the Torah is perhaps lacking in understanding in our time, and to take away the places in which we no longer see an application or a justified application. For example, in, quite frankly, the things being described in this week's Torah portion as they relate to other inhabitants of the land of Israel or even to fake prophets. So I think we have a lot to think about, and the good news is that Torah study will be largely based on this discussion, so you can start thinking about your statements and your questions for now. But I want to just leave us with this sort of parting thought, that I think Nachmanides is the one leaving us with the greatest teaching for today, which is know that the fences exist, but try to understand why they were put up in the first place. And ultimately speaking, and this is where we go beyond Nachmanides, that if the fence is too high, or if the fence was perhaps built in a time and a place that no longer apply to now, or if perhaps they never should have been built in the first place, for example, in the case of prohibitions against women's involvement in Judaism, right? These are the places in which we can either shorten the fence or remove the fence altogether. We're not necessarily adding or subtracting. We are simply making sure that our changing and evolving relationship to the Torah is not being obfuscated by fences that were created potentially 1,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago, or more. So with that, I know it was a little bit all over the place this morning. I hope I made some sense, but I wish you all a Shabbat Shalom. And as I said, we're going to read the first 12 verses of chapter 13 in the book of Deuteronomy. A reminder again, page 1263, and in the Plat Chumash, page 1123 in the Women's Torah Commentary. Baruch et Adonai HaMorach. Baruch Adonai HaMorach le'olam va'ed. Baruch ata Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch ata Adonai noten ha'Torah. Amen. Et kol hadavar asher anochi metzaveh etchem oto tishmeru lasot lo tosef alav velo tigera mimenu ki yakum b'kirbecha navi o cholam chalom ונתן אליך אות או מופת, ובא האות והמופת, אשר דיבר אליך לאמור, נהלכה אחרי אלוהים אחרים, אשר לא ידעתם ונאהבתם, לא תשמע דברי הנביא ההוא, אל חולם החלום ההוא, כי מנסה אדוני אלוהיכם אתכם לדעת, השיכם אביהם את אדוני אלוהיכם בכל לבבכם ובכל נפשכם, אחרי אדוני אלוהיכם תלכו ואותו תיראו ואת מצוותיו תשמרו ובקולו תשמעו ואותו תעבודו ובו תדבקון והנביא ההוא בו חולם החלום ההוא יומת, כי דבר שרה אדוני אלוהיכם המוציא אתכם מארץ מצרים והפודך מבית עבדים להדיחך מן הדרך אשר ציווך אדוני אלוהיך ללכת בה, וביארת הרע מקרבך, כי יסיתך אחיך בן אמך או בנך או ביתך או אשת חיכך, או Seter Lemor Lelecha V'navda Elohim Achevim Asher Lo Yadata Ata Ve'avotecha Melohei Hamim Asher Sevivotechem Hakarobim Elecha O Harachokim Mimecha Miktzei Haaretz Ve'ad Katzei Haaretz Lo To'aveto Ve'lo Ve'lo Tishema Elav Ve'lo Tachos Einecha Alav Ve'lo Tachmol Ve'lo Techase Alav Ki Arog Tahareginu Yadecha Tievo Barishona Lahamito Ve'yad Kol Ha'am Be'acharona Uskalto Ba'avanim Vamet Ki Vikesh Lehadichecha Me'al Adonai Elohecha Hamotziacha Me'eretz Mitzrayim Ibeit Avadim V'chol Yisrael Yishme'u V'yirun Ve'lo Yosifu Lasod Kadavar Hara Hazeh Bekirbecha. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan lanu torat emet v'chayei olam nata b'tochenu. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah. Amen. So as we have our Torah in our midst, we will take a moment to offer our Mishaberach, our prayer for healing. And I'll read first the names of those in our community and are connected to our community we're thinking of this morning, but certainly to invite you, as I'm reading these names, to share names at home out loud as well. We're thinking first of Emunah Chaba, Sandra Furman, Morty Lynn, Phyllis Katz, Raina Walsh, Deirdre Klein, Harav Tuvia Abraham Ben Asher Belea, Stephanie Skit, Nancy DeMate, Andrew Lesser, Jean Ben Sadun, Gloria Taradash, Andrea Klausner, Judy Stern, Miriam Kornfeld, Raz Brody, Chana Ruth Bat Sarah, Marlise Silverberg, Louis Davidson, Susan Spruce, Fagel Tzipora Bat Elisheva Bat Sarah, Richard Gambino, Michelle Sawicki, Idel Basha Bat Yitzchak, Tzvi Menachem Ben Chaim, Rivka Bat Devora, Amy and Gavin Tucker, Janice Kurz, David Dowling, Neil Elliott and Eileen Rosen, Israel Ben Yitzchak, Ben Sion Ben Moshe, Lorraine Danis, Buddy Kassoff, Shelley Newmark, David Kyle Klopman, Rivka Bat Rachel, Sarah Bat Chana, Moshe Eliezer Ben Sivya, Peretz Ben Yehuda, and Leah Bat Naomi. And we think of all those in need of healing, and we add to our hearts and our minds all those around the world who are in need of healing as we sing our healing prayer. El na refanala, El na refanala, El na refanala, Refua shelema, El na refanalo, El na refanalo, El na refanalo, Refua shelema. Now invite those at home who choose to do so to please rise as we lift and rest in Torah. Yamdu hamagbiya ve'hagolel. Vezot haTorah asher sa Moshe lifnei bnei Yisrael al pi Adonai ve'ad Moshe. Torah, 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 Torah tziva lanu Moshe. Torah, 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 tziva lanu Moshe. Torah tziva lanu Moshe. Torah, 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 tziva lanu Moshe. Torah, 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 tziva lanu Moshe. If you're still standing, you may be seated at home. Close this. And this morning's Haftarah is the third of the Haftarot of consolation, carrying us from Tisha B'Av all the way until our new year, till Rosh Hashanah, which is coming up sooner than we may realize. So if you're following along at home, the Haftarah for this morning from Parshat Re'eh is found on page 1290 in the Plowed Chumash. If you're following at home in another form, you're looking for the book of Isaiah, Prophet Isaiah, chapter 54, verses 11 to 50, chapter 55, verse 5. So again, chapter 54, verse 11, through chapter 55, verse 5. And I'll first offer our blessings. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar b'nviim tovim v'ratza v'divreihem hanemarim be'emet. Baruch atah Adonai abocher b'torah u'Moshe abdo u'Yisrael amo b'nviei ha'emet v'tzedek. Ah, unhappy storm-tossed soul, with none to comfort you. I will make garnets, your building stones, and sapphires your foundations. I will build your towers with rubies, your gates with precious stones, your border with gems. All your children shall be taught by the Eternal, and great shall be the happiness of your children. You shall be established in righteousness, safe from oppression and unafraid, safe from terror. It shall not come near you. Should any attack you, it will not be my doing. Whoever attacks you will fall on your account. It is I who created the smith, who fans the coals in the fire and forges weapons by his work. I also create the destroyer to wreak havoc. No weapon fashioned against you can succeed. You shall defeat all who rise to accuse you. That is the heritage of the eternal servants, and I am the source of their vindication, says the Eternal. Come, all who are thirsty, come for water. Even if you have no money, come buy food and eat. Come buy food without money, wine and milk without cost. Why spend money for what is not bread? Why spend your wages for what does not satisfy? Listen well to me, and you shall eat what is good, and your soul shall delight in abundance. Open your ears and come to me, hearken, and you shall live. I will make an everlasting covenant with you, like the true love I extended to David. As once I made him a witness to the world, a prince and commander of nations. So now you shall summon people you do not know, and people that do not know you shall come running to you, because of the Eternal your God, the Holy One of Israel, who has given you glory. And we're back in our prayer books on page 372, if you would like to join with. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, tzur kol haolamim, tzadik bechol hadorot, ha'el haneman haomer b'yosef, hamdaber umkayem, shekol devarav emet v'tzedek, al haTorah ve'al ha'avodah ve'al hanivim ve'al yom ha'shabbat hazeh, שנתת לנו אדוני אלוהינו לקדושה ולמנוחה, לכבוד ולתפארת. על הכל אדוני אלוהינו אנחנו מודים לך ומברכים אותך, כי יתברך שמך בפי כל חי תמיד לעולם ועד. ברוך אתה אדוני מקדש השבת. Before we return the Torah to the Ark, we're going to offer first a few blessings. The first thing that we are going to do is this week, Rosh Chodesh is coming up, Rosh Chodesh Elul in particular. So we're going to mark the coming of the new week on page 379. And again, if you are able at home, please rise and remain standing through the blessing for our country and Israel as well. Yehi ratzon milfanecha Adonai Eloheinu ve'Elohei avotenu ve'imotenu shetechadesh aleinu et hachodesh haba l'tova u'livracha v'titen lanu chayim arukim chayim shel shalom chayim shel parnasa chayim shetehevanu ahavat Torah v'yirat shamayim chayim she'im alu mishalot libenu l'tova. Amen. Our God and God of our ancestors, may the new month bring us goodness and blessing. May we have long life, peace, and prosperity, a life exalted by love of Torah and reverence for the divine, a life in which the longings of our hearts are fulfilled for good. Rosh Chodesh Elul yeh b'yom chamishi v'shishi. Rosh Chodesh Elul will begin on Thursday and Friday of this coming month. We remain standing as we turn back now to page 376, a prayer for our country. We'll read again in the middle of the page. Thus says Adonai, this is what I desire, to unlock the fetters of wickedness and untie the cords of lawlessness, to let the oppressed go free, to break off every yoke. Share your bread with the hungry and take the wretched poor into your home. When you see the naked, give clothing and do not ignore your own kin. If you banish the yoke from your midst and menacing hand, the evil speech, if you offer compassion to the hungry and satisfy the famished creature, then your light shall shine in the darkness. O guardian of life and liberty, may our nation always merit your protection. Teach us to give thanks for what we have by sharing it with those who are in need. Keep our eyes open to the wonders of creation and alert to the care of the earth. May we never be lazy in the work of peace. May we honor those who have died in defense of our ideals. Grant our leaders wisdom and forbearance. May they govern with justice and compassion. Help us all to appreciate one another and to respect the many ways that we may serve you. May our homes be safe from affliction and strife, and our country be sound in body and spirit. Amen. Prayer for the State of Israel, page 377. Avinu shabashamayim tzur Yisrael v'goalo, barech et medinat Yisrael reshit tzmichat gulatenu. Hagen aleha be'evrat chastecha ufros aleha sukat shlomecha. Ushlach orcha v'amitcha l'rasheha sareha v'yotzea. V'taknem be'etzah tova milfanecha v'natata shalom ba'aretz. V'simchat olam liyoshveha v'nomar. Amen. O Heavenly One, Protector and Redeemer of Israel, bless the state of Israel, which marks the dawning of hope for all who seek peace. Shield it beneath the wings of your love. Spread over it the canopy of your peace. Send your light and truth to all who lead and advise, guiding them with your good counsel. Establish peace in the land and fullness of joy for all who dwell there. Amen. Remain standing as we turn to page 374. Page 374 as we return the Torah to the Ark. Yehalelu et Shem Adonai, ki nizkav shemo levado, Odo al eretz v'shamayim, vayarem keren li'amo, tehila lechol, v'asinidav, livnei Yisrael am kerovo. Hallelujah. Torati al tazohu et kaimehi lamachazikim ba vetom cheha meushar deracheha darchei noam vechol tivoteha Shalom, Ashirenu Adonai, Elecha v'nashuva, Chadesh, Chadesh Yameinu, Chadesh Yameinu We turn now to page 586 at the bottom of the page, Aleinu L'Shabeach. Aleinu L'Shabeach, Ladon HaKol, Latet Gedula Leotzer Breshit, Shelo Asanu Kigoye Haratzot, ולא שמענו כמשפחות האדמה, שלא שם חלקנו כהם וגורלנו ככל המונם, ואנחנו קוראים ומשתחווים ומודים לפני מלך מלכי המלכים הקדוש ברוך הוא. ונאמר והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד ושמו אחד. Now I ask those in mourning and those observing yahrzeit to please remain standing. Everyone else may be seated at this time. First, we think of those who have passed in our community in recent months. Nancy Fisher, Saul Fisher, Edwin Friedman, Sandra Friedman, Lois Herr, Philip Idone, Laura Kurtz, Maya Rosofsky, Vera Shaps, Lisa Schneidman, Norma Small, and Marjorie Weinberg Berman. We also mark the yahrzeit that occurred during the last week for Simon Abraham, Aileen Bacon, Frederick Baum, Monroe Bohm, Jules Cornfield, Charles Danoff, Zita Danoff, Phyllis Davis, Selma Goldman, Michael Green, Sidney Grossman, Irving Kirstein, Sophie Klotman, Abraham Lasnik, Dorothy Metzger, Andrea Ruby Okino, Joseph Palladino, Jim Ritvo, Bonnie Sawicki, Dorothy Simon, Nathan Spitzer, Sidney Throne, Jack Wiener, Martin Weinstein, and Irving Zaretsky. If you have names of anyone for whom you're saying Kaddish that we did not share, this would be the time to share them at home. I'll ask the mourners to join me on page 598 as we recite the mourners' Kaddish. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah, ve'alma divrach yirutei ve'amlich malchutei, v'chayichonu v'yomechonu v'chayei d'chol beit Yisrael, ba'agala v'zman kariv v'imru amen. Yehei shemei Rabbah mevarach le'alam u'le'almei almai. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shemei d'kudsha b'richu. Le'elam min kol birchata v'shirata tush b'chata v'nechamata ta'amiran be'alma v'imru amen. Yehei shalom Rabbah min shemaya v'chayim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom bin ramav hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Zichronam livracha, may every one of their memories be for a blessing. Please be seated at home if you're still standing. Shabbat shalom, everyone. Just a few announcements to make before we conclude our service and do Kiddush. The first, of course, is to join us for Torah study at noon if you are able. We'll begin really promptly this morning, a lot to discuss. Also a reminder for Havdalah services this evening, 7 o'clock. Also a reminder that tomorrow will be the last of Ruth Joseph's book groups for the summer, sadly, but it's going to be a great finale, I am told. We'll meet again at 11 o'clock tomorrow morning, 11 o'clock Sunday. If you're interested in joining, I think it's still possible maybe to find a way to get in, but please contact Ruth directly. Again, Sunday, tomorrow, 11 o'clock. Also a reminder of the film we are showing tomorrow at 7 p.m., which will be screened online, called Crescendo, which is a story of a creation of an Israeli-Palestinian youth orchestra, which will be followed by a discussion led by me afterwards. So the way this will work is like what we did with Fiddler. We have a Zoom that everyone will log into. We'll share the code to be able to watch it on something called Vimeo. You'll watch the movie and then come back for the discussion itself. So if you have any questions, concerns about that, email me certainly before tomorrow and I will help as best as I can. Also a reminder, this Monday is the last of our Summertime Lunchtime Conversation series at 12:30. This one prompted by an Eli talk by Dr. Zohar Raviv on Between Unity and Uniformity, the Many Lenses of Israel Education, which will be followed again by a discussion with me as well. Also a reminder of the regular 5 o'clock Social Justice Committee meeting, and also an addition towards the end of the month, the last Monday of the month, we'll be having our next panel discussion on racial injustice. this time focusing really very intently on here on the East End and where do we go from here, what can we do, and especially very happy and appreciative that Andy and Alyssa have been able to pull together, again, some great speakers with some help from our Social Justice Committee, including several young people who can help to perhaps give us a little bit of perspective on what other generations are thinking about what's going on today in this country and what's been going on historically. Also, a reminder that on Wednesday evening at 7 o'clock, we have an art workshop with Lorraine Pepper called New Beginnings Peace Planting. I believe it may still be possible to get the necessary parts to participate. That is again at 7 o'clock on Wednesday, but you must contact Shelley Lichtenstein immediately to get all that information. Also a reminder on Thursday that we are very excited to show a one-person play called The Ethics of the Fathers, aka The Gangster and the Grandpa, which is a one-person show exploring morality, legacy, and Jewish identity in America, and is followed by a conversation with the actor-playwright himself, Jesse Bernstein. This is generously sponsored by John and Suzanne Golden. We appreciate their generosity very much. Also, a reminder that our annual members meeting is coming up. We are not going to be able to feed you, as they say, but very important things, as always, every single year, even in a non-COVID year, even not in a year leading up to a renovation, but this year especially, it's a chance to connect with each other, to go over the budget, to bring in new officers in our board. So it's a great thing and a really important piece of our temple. And so if you're a member of the temple, please try to find a way to be there with us on that Sunday as well. We still have many other things going on through the rest of the summer, and then things that we are planning for the high holidays, and to look very carefully this week for more information about the holidays specifically, a lot more information coming. So with that, I wish you all a Shabbat Shalom, and also before I forget, even though it was yesterday, in the event that she or Jackie is watching, we wish Marlise Silverberg a very happy birthday, our wonderful Marlise. I hope it was a happy one yesterday. We miss you. Okay, we're going to turn now to conclude our service in Kelohenu, page 626. Ein Kelohenu, ein Kadonenu, ein Kemalkeinu, ein Kemoshienu, Michelohenu, Michadonenu, Michemalkeinu, Michemoshienu, Nodel Eloheinu, Nodel Emalkeinu, Nodel Emalkeinu, Nodel Moshienu, Baruch Eloheinu, Baruch Adonenu, Baruch Malkeinu, Baruch Moshienu, Atahu Eloheinu, Atahu Adonenu, Atahu Malkeinu, Atahu Moshienu. And if you have some wine or grape juice handy, we'll turn to page 604 for Kiddush. Veshamru b'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat, לעשות את השבת לדורתם ברית עולם, ביני ובין בני ישראל, אותי לעולם, אותי לעולם. ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת, לעשות את השבת לדורתם ברית עולם. כי ששת ימים עשה אדוני את השמיים ואת הארץ, ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת, לעשות את השבת לדורתם ברית עולם. וביום השביעי שבת וינפש, שבת וינפש, שבת וינפש, ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת, לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם. על כן ברך אדוני את יום השבת ויקדשהו סברי. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם בורא פרי הגפן. Amen. Chaim, everyone. Shabbat Shalom. Hope to see you online in a few minutes for Torah study. And if not, I wish you a wonderful rest of your Shabbat and of your weekend, and look forward to seeing you online soon. Shabbat Shalom.